Greetings to each of you, and welcome to this month's MCC webinar. This is sort of a behind-the-scenes look at MCC's work. We have people joining us some on Zoom and some on Facebook Live. So welcome to each of you. Thank you for your ongoing support of MCC and for your interest in our work. We're so pleased and grateful that you're part of the MCC story, and we're thrilled that we can offer you this sort of unique way to kind of get a peek into what we are doing and the way we serve in the name of Christ. My name is Ann Graber-Hirschberger. I'm serving as the Executive Director of Mennonite Central Committee US. Today I'm your host, and I am here in Akron, Pennsylvania, in the United States. Just a few logistics as we get started. If you're here on Zoom, you'll be kept muted throughout the seminar. If you're here on Facebook, you're also on mute. If you'd like to submit a question or a comment, we would very much welcome that and appreciate that. In Zoom, do that through the Q&A function. You can find it in the black bar at the very bottom of your screen. When you move your mouse around, it'll pop up. And it looks like a little, two little speech bubbles. Use that instead of the chat so that we can manage those questions. And if you have joined via Facebook, please submit your questions or comments to the comments section in Facebook Live, and somebody's monitoring those, and we'll collect those and then pass them on to me and then to the panelists. We'll try to address as many questions as possible. As many questions as you had, we might not be able to get to all of them. But we are recording this session, and the recording will be made public then following the seminar, and there would be a link provided probably back to you in your invitation. So our topic today, it's MCC and climate change. So timing seems to be pretty good for this because on Sunday, the 26th Climate Summit, World Climate Summit, will be beginning in Glasgow, Scotland. For more than 100 years, MCC has worked to address food security and now climate change through different farming techniques, through policy approaches, and through advocacy. This presentation will focus on case studies from our Africa programs, as well as advocacy responses for climate action in the United States. I keep learning more about how climate change is impacting so many of the places we work and many of the things that we know are important: water, food, people's livelihoods. Our partners tell us that their lives are becoming more difficult due to changes in temperature, weather patterns. And we want to care for these people and for the wonderful creation that God has given us. This is part of our mission. So we look forward to unpacking this over the next hour with our speakers. Just to give a view of how this is going to happen, our speakers will speak, and then we'll have for about 30 minutes so all together, or filling out this first half hour. Then we'll have about 30 minutes for questions and feedback. And really encourage you to submit your questions and comments, and we'll get to as many of those as possible. So let me introduce our speakers. Vurayayi Pugeni is the MCC Area Director for the Southern and Central Africa region and Nigeria. Prior to this role, Pugeni worked in planning, learning, and disaster response for MCC and was the MCC representative on the Canadian Coalition for Climate Change and Development, known as C4D. Pugeni is also on the Board of Reference for the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions. The goal of that group, of which MCC is a part, the goal is to advance thinking and action in Anabaptist and other faith communities to mitigate climate change. Kate Parsons is a legislative associate for international affairs at the MCC office in Washington, D.C., where, among other things, she focuses on international climate advocacy. Originally from Michigan, Kate attended Calvin University and is now completing a master's in development management at American University. And Tammy Alexander is the director of our National Advocacy and Program for MCC US. She's been with MCC since 2007, focusing primarily on US policies related to immigration and climate change. Tammy has a master's in international development from American University, and prior to joining MCC, she worked as a propulsion engineer for the Space Shuttle program. So welcome to our three presenters today, and I will turn it over to you for our presentations today.
Thank you all for coming today to listen to us today as we share stories of how MCC is working to address the impacts of climate change in Africa. My name is Vurayayi Pugeni, as what Anne has already introduced. Today I will be talking about why we care so much about climate change. I will also be talking about sharing some stories from our programs of the work that MCC is doing. I'm looking forward to walking with you through this journey. Before my slides can come up, I also would like to extend a special thanks to you all for coming today to spend some time with us. Thank you very much. Our work as MCC would not be possible without your support. Cameroon, are you ready with the slides? Thank you. So, as I have mentioned earlier on, today we are talking about MCC's work on addressing the impacts of climate change. Like I said, I'll be sharing stories. Some of the stories are going to be painful, but my desire or my goal is to show you how MCC is trying to at least put a smile on people who are painfully affected by the impacts of climate change. I know that for most people, climate change is an issue of debate, an issue of research, an issue of science. But for us here in Africa, it is a reality that is affecting women and girls, boys and men in different and painful ways. Next slide. So, why do we care about climate change? I would like to start by saying that it is because we love people and we love God's creation. It is also because we have the responsibility to care for creation, not only for today, but also for future generations. We care so much about creation because we know that the future generations will depend on it. Our children, our grandchildren, granddaughters, grandsons, they all want to depend on the same creation that we have today. And it is our responsibility to care for that. Well, I would like to let you know that MCC's strategic directions for 2020 to 2025 are clear about MCC's desire and commitment to increase the capacity of the church and other partners that we work with as they support and equip vulnerable people, especially people who have been uprooted or displaced. In its strategic directions, MCC commits to designing and assessing its program and operations in light of MCC's commitment to care for God's creation and accompanying marginalized communities that are harmed by climate change. So MCC is really
It looks to me as if Pugeni lost power, and I'm sorry about that, but it also does seem to be probably a good example of the kinds of things that that people deal with in different parts of the world. So I would suggest at this point that we might take a pause in Pugeni's presentation and maybe move ahead to the next section, and then we can readjust as he comes back. So I'm not sure if would that be Kate or Tammy?
That would be me.
Tammy. Very good. Thank you, Tammy.
Yeah, and I think it's slide 11, if we can go to that one. Thank you, Anne. Great, thank you very much. Yeah, so sorry for this little rearrangement in our presentation order, but we can go ahead and talk about advocacy for a bit. So just thinking about how MCC responds to climate change in the US. And one of the ways that we do that is through advocacy. And you can think of advocacy as a set of organized actions aimed at influencing or changing behaviors, policies, and resource allocation of individuals or institutions that hold power for the betterment of people affected by an issue. And I'm seeing that Pugeni is back. I'm wondering if before we get too far into this, we want to go back to Pugeni.
Tammy, I'm very happy to take on if you want, because I know that your conversations would be reflecting on the stories that I will share.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. My apologies to all of you. I had a power cut, and as a result, we lost internet, and also, yeah. So right now, I'm using another source of Wi-Fi connection. So I'm using my phone, fortunately. So yes, let's go back to the slide that I was on. Thank you. Okay, good. So we had discussed about why we care about climate change. And again, my apologies for that connection mistake that happened as a result of the power cut. I'm really sorry about it. And of course, the power is back again, which is quite interesting. So that's interesting. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Okay, so why is MCC prioritizing our work around climate change? Climate change doesn't affect everyone equally. So at MCC, we understand that. And here in Africa, we really see it every day. When we visit our projects, the project that MCC supports, when we visit our partners, when we visit with communities where the partners work. So what we are seeing is that the poor, especially those that are in developing countries, like some of the countries that I am responsible for, are the ones that are disproportionately affected and consequently in the greatest need for adaptation strategies. So they are the ones that really suffer the most. Women and men are affected, especially those that are working in natural resource sectors such as agriculture. However, the impact of climate change on gender is not the same. In Africa, especially in the Scan region where I really work, we are increasingly seeing that the vulnerability of women is a result of the fact that they are the ones that work or depend on the natural resources. So they depend on the natural resources for their livelihoods, be it fuel to cook, be it wild fruits that they gather and sell for them to be able to fend for their family. In addition, the differences between men and women can also be seen in their differential roles, responsibilities, decision-making, access to land and natural resources, opportunities and needs, which are held by both sexes differently. Culture is also another big factor. So MCC prioritizes the work around climate change because we do understand that vulnerability is actually more, one, for the countries that are less developed and have got less adaptive capacity, two, for the genders that are also really more vulnerable. We also realize that even in terms of the geographic location, the geographic location itself is another factor. Some people are situated in places that are hit the hardest by climate change. So MCC really cares about it because of that. Next slide. So how is MCC addressing these challenges that that I was talking about? Well, the first thing that MCC is doing is to come up with climate change adaptation activities. I think in the earlier slide, I spoke about adaptive capacity. Perhaps we need to define what we mean by that. So in our programs, we define adaptive capacity as the capability of a system to respond to climate variability by reducing vulnerability or enhancing resilience. So we are either reducing vulnerability or we are enhancing resilience. And vulnerability, we look at it as the ability or inability of individuals and systems to respond to external stress placed on livelihoods. Resilience to us is the capacity to absorb such disturbances so as to retain function, structure, identity, and feedbacks. So we want to look at how MCC is working to help communities adapt to climate change. We want to see if we are reducing vulnerability and increasing resilience in the communities that we work with. One way is through improved water access. In the picture that you are looking at to the far right is a sand dam. Sand dam is a structure. A sand dam is a structure that is created or constructed across a riverbed. The purpose of this structure is to trap the sand that is washed down the riverbed whenever a flash flood or a thunderstorm happens. As the sand is trapped and that structure is full of sand, water is then collected in the sand. And that water that is collected in the sand start to increase the ability of that dry area to act as a buffer for extended periods of water scarcity. So if you now have water in the sand, it means that the vegetation around the sand dam can now have water for survival. This is one way that we are addressing challenges of the impacts of climate change to biodiversity by having water availability, recharging the water aquifers, or recharging groundwater storage systems to rejuvenate vegetation, diversity, and the plant life that is around that water source. So in addition to doing that, the sand dam becomes a source of water for communities. So when MCC supports communities with structures like a sand dam, the net impact is that the sand dam itself rejuvenates the vegetation around it. You can see how green it is there in the picture. And when that happens, it means there's increased fodder for livestock. There is also increased availability of clean water sources for women. You can see the picture on the left where MCC provided a shallow well that women are now fetching water from. Because the water table is now higher due to the recharge as a result of the sand dam, people are now able to access clean water close by. And with clean water, people are able to use it for domestic use. They can also use it for nutrition gardens, which increases income and food security in the family. Of course, the vegetation becomes fodder for animals, which again also increases nutrition, food security, and assets that can be sold or that can be transferred for cultural ceremonies, or that communities can also just perhaps utilize as labor in their households. Now, when you think of it, the impact on gender when you create such structures as sand dams is humongous. It's huge. Women are no longer walking long distances to fetch water. They are able to get it close by. But because of climate change, in communities that are not able to get structures like a sand dam, women are walking very, very long distances to get water. Next slide. The other challenge for pests on a field, and there you can see the maize stalk borer that has been scouted there. So pests are a challenge, and pests can actually lead to loss of yields by almost 40%, according to the Food Agriculture Organization. So increase in pest population is pests continue to report increases in pests such as aphids, whiteflies, stem borers, termites, and so on. So how is MCC helping with this?
Pugeni continues to have some issues with internet, so we'll just hope that that we can manage. So hang tight with us.
MCC is helping with this by thank you so much for saying that my internet was unstable, but I just hope that it will be okay. So what I was talking about was with this technology that MCC introduced, we are growing desmodium, which is a grass species in between a maize field. So when you grow desmodium, desmodium is a legume, but one aspect about desmodium is that it smells so badly to the maize stalk borer, which is a pest. So the pest doesn't like the smell of desmodium. So as the pests invade the maize field, they are repelled out of the field by the stinky grass, which is desmodium. So when MCC did this, it was quite good. We learned a lot. People who were growing desmodium in their field, who were intercropping it with maize, were able to protect their crop from the pest. However, there was a problem. The problem was that the pest was now leaving the field and invading the neighbor's field. And as you all may know, MCC is very, very strong and passionate about peace building. So we discovered that this technology, while it could control pests, it was not perfect because the pest was able to migrate to other people's field. How did we improve? We improved by growing napier grass around that plot. As you can see on the picture there are 3 rows of napier grass around the maize plot. So that napier grass is very sweet. It has a very sweet scent for the stalk borer. However, it is very sticky. So as soon as the maize stalk borer is repelled out of the field by desmodium grass, it comes out of the plot, is attracted by the nice smell from the napier grass, and of course it sticks. And we were able to control pests using a strategy that enhanced peace, that was able to build community solidarity, and that was able to increase yields. Next slide. Another way is that sometimes climate change is just so terrible that even if you try to come up with adaptation strategies, it is very difficult. MCC in Ethiopia have realized that sometimes the hardest part is for communities to be able to bounce back after a shock as a result of climate change. So MCC realized that climate change impacts were severe on certain months of the year and less severe on certain months of the year. One way to use resources carefully was to focus on the months when climate change impacts are severe. So through the Seasonal Safety Net program, MCC provides some support to families during specific periods of the year, perhaps let's say from January to March. And during those times, people are able to work and receive certain benefits as they do work. So they can do environmental rehabilitation, they can plant trees, and for those 3 months, they do cash for work and receive a cash payment for them to support their families. The benefit of this is that it is a predictable transfer, so poor people that are affected by climate change can anticipate that it will occur. Number 2, the support that is given is not given for free, rather it is given to communities so that they come together and work on protecting their environments. So this is one way that MCC again is addressing climate change. Next slide. We spoke about how gender affects people differently and how gender leads to vulnerability and how climate change affects different genders differently. In Zimbabwe, MCC is working with its partners to address gender issues. We realize that because of climate change, women especially, are finding it very difficult, especially with household chores. So MCC has come up with programs that are teaching men how to cook. It also supports projects that are also not only teaching men how to cook, but that are increasing dialogue about work responsibilities and how to share work in the household. In the picture there, you can see two men cooking their meal. The one on the right is cooking for his family. The one on the left is cooking while other women are watching. That man who is cooking while other women are watching actually came up with his own signature recipe, which is so good and so delicious. People love it. And he moves around teaching anyone who is interested how to make that recipe. So we realize that climate change affects different genders, and we come up with gender transformative programs that at least help women, that at least alleviate that burden on women. Again, it's not that MCC is able to stop climate change. We are not saying MCC can actually reduce the impacts by perhaps doing something that is really huge, but we are saying in small ways, we are able to do these things and they are really making a difference in communities. We are also trying to say that you can use these as examples when talking to your government officials about what perhaps people in the US can do. You can actually do this by supporting some of these examples of adaptation work that MCC is doing. Next slide. So when men join the cooking competitions or the cooking classes are always concluded with a celebration. And that celebration is the Men Can Cook competition, where men come together and show off their skills in front of young boys, in front of young girls, in front of the chief, in front of our ancestral representatives, those people who represent the systems that shape the gender norms of a community. So that on its own is so transformational to watch when men do cook in front of everyone and present their gifts for everyone to see with such vulnerability, such acceptance and understanding. In the picture are men who had won teapots as a result of the work they did. And those teapots were provided because in Zimbabwe, teapots are seen as assets for women. So when men win assets that are traditionally known to be assets for women, what it means is that you have enhanced conversations about asset ownership in the family. Who owns what? Why is it that a pot and a pan belongs to a woman, but a cow, maybe a donkey and a cow belongs to a man? So this is now extending further conversations about asset ownership, normalizing the fact that even men can own proudly pots and pans. Next slide. Well, sometimes disasters hit, and the best we can do is to provide food aid. That picture is taken out of the Democratic Republic of Congo. So when MCC faces communities that have been affected by climate change, we realize that sometimes we need to provide immediate relief and we need to move in very quickly with support, because sometimes it can be as bad as a life and death situation. People have no food. People have depleted all their assets as they were trying to adapt. People have really are desperate for just even the basics: water, food, shelter. So in such cases, MCC will provide emergency food relief. I really like that picture of two kids feeding each other, and that picture was taken in DRC. I think what I learned from that picture is that no matter how difficult it can be in life, people can still care for each other. I love that picture. It reminds me of the care you give to MCC, the support, the prayers, and I would like to encourage you to keep doing that, for we can all care for each other despite the challenges that we face. Next slide. And here is a story of what people are doing in Zimbabwe: climate change advocacy by promoting clean energy solutions. While most people in the developing world are not responsible for the emissions that are leading to the climate change, they are also still passionate about doing their fair share. I think even as we think about it, these vulnerable groups are also working on solarization. They are also working on clean energy solutions. We have seen firsthand how communities are leveraging biogas for fuel, for cooking. so they can protect their environment. We have seen how communities are putting bylaws to really ensure that they don't cut trees, but they protect them. Of course, young people, as you can see, those two ladies, Cynthia and Primrose, working hard. They are engineers. They are clean energy engineers, working hard in their community with support from MCC to promote clean energy solutions and bring women together, forming a large movement called the Women's Coalition on Climate Change, which is in Zimbabwe. That coalition is showcasing the work that women are doing to respond to climate change. And they want to do their fair share. I think this slide is a good transition to Tammy, who will talk about some of the advocacy work. But I just wanted to emphasize that no matter how difficult it is for these communities, they also care for creation. They also take responsibility. They know they have a role to play. Thank you so much. And I'm really sorry about the internet challenges that I faced today. And I'm so thankful that you were patient with me and you gave me your time. Thank you so much. I think this slide gets us into Tammy's presentation fairly well.
Yeah, thank you, Pugeni. Thank you for sticking with us through all of those challenges. And thank you for sharing those wonderful stories about how MCC is supporting communities around the world who are working to address climate change. We're going to shift a little bit here and talk about how MCC responds in the US, and that's primarily through advocacy. You heard this definition of advocacy, but I wanted to put it in a little bit simpler language. We really see our role, our MCC role in advocacy in the US as one that amplifies the voices of those who are most impacted by climate change and helping to have those voices and their concerns heard by government officials. And then also engaging churchgoers in the US to do the same, to engage in advocacy actions themselves. And then this is all for the purpose of trying to alleviate suffering and help to make people's lives better. Next slide. So we believe that as Christians, we're called to speak with and on behalf of the most vulnerable. So if you write a personal letter or sign a petition to Congress or to the White House, that demonstrates that you care about the impacts of climate change, and that works to hold our government accountable for policies that either positively or negatively are impacting God's planet and God's people. So we see that as an act of love and hope. And Pugeni talked about these uneven impacts of climate change globally. And you might know that the US is the world's largest historic emitter of greenhouse gases. And so we really do have a moral obligation to lower our own CO2 emissions and also to support countries and communities that are being disproportionately impacted by climate change. Next slide. So we work at advocacy in a variety of ways. We do that through both direct political engagement and also through what we call public engagement. So when you sign a petition or write a letter or meet with your policymakers, that's political engagement. If you write a letter to the editor in your local newspaper, or maybe organize or participate in a prayer vigil or another type of direct action, we call that public engagement. MCC engages in both sets of activities. We sign onto coalition letters, we meet with policymakers, we work to connect our partners around the world directly with US policymakers. We hold educational events, we do advocacy days and campaigns and preaching in churches. Next slide. And just as we work in partnership around the world, we also work in partnership in Washington, D.C. when we do this advocacy work. So some of our partners are the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions, Creation Justice Ministries, Energy and Ecology Working Group, and Interaction. Next slide. And then in terms of domestic policy, we're looking at a variety of issues right now. You might be reading in the news a lot this week or the last few weeks about a couple of bills that are being debated in Congress. There's this big bipartisan infrastructure bill, and then there's a reconciliation bill. And those two have really become linked together because the infrastructure bill was passed with both Republican and Democratic support in the Senate, but there are progressive Democrats in the House that will not vote for that bill until they also get a vote on this large reconciliation bill. Now, both of these bills have provisions related to climate change. They have various programs for lowering US carbon emissions, such as clean energy incentives. The reconciliation bill in particular also does some work to address racial equity issues involving clean air, where power plants and other polluting industries are located. The provisions in the reconciliation bill, however, would take a more aggressive approach to lowering US emissions. So that's why the more progressive Democrats are pushing for that. The Biden administration was really hoping to be able to take the passage of these bills to the COP26 conference that was mentioned at the beginning. That's the big international conference on climate change that's held every year starting this Sunday. It remains to be seen if they'll get anything set by the end of this week before that begins. Some other bills, just to mention these briefly, that we're following: the Thrive Act, which is a bill that would respond to climate change and racial equity issues. The Reclaim Act, that looks at having a just transition for fossil fuel workers and communities. And then carbon pricing proposals. And we're especially watching these proposals for how they might actually harm certain groups such as rural communities, communities of color, and immigrant communities. So those are the federal policies. That's what MCC focuses on in our DC office. You can go to the next slide. But I also wanted to mention there's a lot of exciting work happening at the state and local level. And so if you're interested in that, here's a couple of organizations you can follow. Interfaith Power and Light has chapters in most states around the country, and they're a partner of MCC's in Washington, DC. And then in Illinois, it's called Illinois Faith in Place. But there's a lot of great work in renewable energy and other legislation at the state level. So I'd encourage you to get involved there. And now I will turn it over to Kate to talk more about advocacy from a foreign policy perspective.
Thanks so much, Tammy. And thanks, Pugeni, for those really inspiring specific examples of people working for change. So I'm going to quickly talk about how we work with partners to develop these international climate advocacy goals, and then what some of those advocacy opportunities are. Our office didn't just decide that we were going to start advocating about climate change. We heard these specific stories of the way that extreme weather and droughts and natural disasters were impacting the communities where we work. And so we undertake this advocacy on behalf of, but also together with our international partners. So you can sort of see in this graph, our office takes these facts, these stories, these policy goals directly to policymakers, but we also share them with you, MCC constituents, so that you can help us to advocate. And that's because US elected officials really want to hear from people who live in their districts. And the more that they're hearing from people about these critical issues, the more they realize that, hey, this is an issue that's a priority for voters. So if you go to the next slide, I just want to highlight some of the things that our partners are telling us. The first is fair share funding for climate relief, adaptation, and mitigation. And when we say fair share funding, we mean that countries that have contributed the most to climate change should also contribute the most money to supporting people who have been negatively affected by that. As Tammy said, you know, the US has the highest rate of emissions per capita in the world. It's the largest historic emitter, but it contributes only 20% of its fair share in climate finance. So we want to call on the US Congress to set aside money for climate relief or disaster response, mitigation, and adaptation. And just quickly what that means, mitigation, like Pugeni said, you gave that example of clean energy solutions. But it's really important to remember that the entire continent of Africa contributes only between 2 and 3% of global carbon emissions. The US alone contributes 15% of global carbon emissions. So we have an outsized responsibility to respond. And that's also why we want to focus really on that adaptation piece. Almost all of the specific examples that Pugeni gave are examples of adaptation. And I do want to be clear that we know that just the US government allocating money is not sufficient to resolve this problem. Sometimes climate finance can have strings attached, or it can fail to address systemic issues. So that's why we encourage US support for less politicized multilateral funds, like the Green Climate Fund, instead of some of the bilateral support that can sometimes be politicized. For the second point, it's really important also how we give this money. We know from experience that local leaders are best positioned to know which interventions are going to be effective and appropriate at a local scale. We have examples of Indigenous communities who have been caring for the earth in sustainable ways for centuries. They have the answers. So their leadership can make climate intervention more effective, but they also need protection. Because one of the things that climate change does is it makes good agricultural land and clean water harder to come by. And as resources become scarcer, they become more valuable. When they become more valuable, there's more political, economic interests involved. And just one example of that, this last year, there were 227 land or environmental defenders who were murdered in the process of trying to protect their homes. So the US can have a voice in this. US companies are often at the forefront of resource extraction. And so US citizens can have a voice in calling for due diligence on human rights and environmental issues with these companies. US elected officials can speak out in defense of land defenders around the world, and they can refuse to assign US funding to extractive projects that might displace people or damage the environment or fuel violence. And the last reason I want to highlight is really the biggest request that I hear from partners, and that's for us to start at home. Climate change has no borders. So domestic policy on climate is foreign policy on climate. We can trace these root causes of displacement, migration, poverty, conflict, food insecurity, all back to the destabilizing impact of climate change. And so the United States has a moral responsibility to help clean up some of these messes, but also to stop contributing to the messes in the first place. And that's something that we are hearing as a request from our international partners. So just quickly in the last minute I have, if you go to the next slide, I want to share how you can join us in this advocacy work. If you aren't already on our mailing list, you can go to washington.mcc.org and sign up for our updates and our action alert. We'll also share in the chat one of our recent alerts that is specifically about global resilience to climate change. And going forward, we'll email you when lawmakers need to hear from you about a bill that's important to us and to our work. You can personalize the letter and you can send it with a click of a button. And on the next page, our website also has a variety of resources that talk about the biblical basis of advocacy, how to reach out to your member of Congress, how to meet with them. This is something that you can do virtually from the comfort of your home more and more now. So we'd love to encourage you to check these out and reach out, of course, with any questions. I want to just express our gratitude for all of you who showed up today, who are showing interest in this topic. We really hope to hear from you and work from you on this going forward. Thank you.
Thank you to Kate, Pugeni, and Tammy for these thoughts, the updates on what's happening, the stories, very clear ways that we might be able to get engaged ourselves or support others who are engaged. So we turn now for the last minutes of this time together for a conversation, question and answer, question and response. We don't always have the right answers or answers, but let's have a bit of conversation. There's a question that has come in from Doug Graber Neufeld, and Kate, I think this would go to you. The climate summit that I talked about, COP26, starts on Sunday. What do you hear from partners? And maybe Pugeni, you might see if you would have an answer to this as well. What do you hear from local partners on the importance of this summit? Are people optimistic about the outcomes? Is there skepticism? It'd be interesting to hear from both Kate and Pugeni on this.
Yeah, I would be interested to hear from Pugeni what he's hearing too. I think that I'm hearing mingled optimism and skepticism, knowing that this is something that we need to discuss at the highest level, but also knowing that we can't only expect these government heads and leaders to resolve our issues. So I think that there's some really exciting parallel movements, advocacy that's happening directly to the heads of state at COP26 and activist movements that are raising issues around it. Pugeni, I don't know if there's anything you would add from what you're hearing where you are.
Well, from where we are, our partners they are very optimistic. They are wishing for more adaptation funds, and they are also wishing for funds that have no strings attached. They are also asking for funds that are accessible for women organizations, because they realize that women are always affected the West, and women organizations do not get a fair share. And finally, they are also asking if the climate funds can be channeled through local partners. So as MCC, we work through our local partners and we support and build their capacity and trust them to implement. They are realizing increasingly that the international NGOs are the ones that are having access to this money because of their connections with the government institutions. And they are wondering when indigenous local partners are also going to be active players in that.
And that is a very, yeah, that's a question on a lot of people's minds. It's a very important question and has one that's been asked for many decades, I think. Another question, Tammy, you might start with this one, and then would like either Kate or Pugeni to jump on as well. It's a question from Gary Yoder. How are we educating individuals and even whole communities as to what actions to take in our daily lives?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in our work in the U.S., MCC mainly focuses on advocacy, on U.S. government policies. But we do have partners like Mennonite Creation Care Network, who have some really terrific resources on just changes that individuals can make in your daily lives, also changes that churches can make to move to more renewable energy. They even work with some grants to churches to put solar panels on churches. They just have some really amazing programs for helping us as individuals and as church communities to reduce our carbon footprint. And that link is, let me find that. It's MennoniteCreationCare.org. I can put that in the chat as well.
There it is already. Pugeni or Kate, would you have anything to add at all?
Yes, I would say that from the perspective of our international program, we do encourage people to come on learning tours, come to talk to MCC, organize a learning tour, come and learn about the impacts of climate change firsthand in our programs, come to see how we are responding and using the resources that you trust us with. We also encourage young adult programs where young adults that have connections to church and their communities can come and serve with MCC for a period of 1 year, or depending on the type of program, 2 years. And we think this is the best way. Young adults come see for themselves, be a part of it, and come back and report back to their constituencies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. A question to probably to you, Pugeni, is you talked about food aid, particularly in disaster. When I think the word you use when we can't do anything else, we need to be able to do this when there's a disaster. But a question come in: is the food aid coordinated with local food producers?
That's an amazing question, and thank you for asking that question. As MCC, we do purchase our food in the region, and we do coordinate with local food producers. So what we do is that even in DRC, if you come to DRC, it is a conflict-affected country. There are certain provinces that may produce a surplus and certain provinces that may not. And MCC is really good at that, making sure that food is purchased close to the vulnerable people, thereby strengthening the markets in that area. Remember, we said we also want to reduce vulnerability and increase resilience. And when we build the market infrastructure, we are building resilience. We are enabling people to have coping mechanisms even well after MCC has left. Thank you.
Yes, I'm pleased to see that question. It means that that people are thinking about the whole picture. Another question for any of you. Actually, I'd like each of you to answer this. What gives you hope in your work around climate change with MCC? It sometimes seems overwhelming, and certainly it's not getting better. So what gives each of you hope?
I can jump in. I think what gives me hope is to know that we're not alone in this work and that we are in many ways following the examples of our partners. I work more on Latin America, and just last week I was able to visit some MCC partners in the south of Mexico who are working with indigenous communities to reclaim some of the traditional methods of agriculture that are more sustainable, that are more effective. And to see this knowledge, this historic knowledge kind of coming and having that, it leading to that adaptation fills me with hope. And to see that they are so passionate and give us an example to follow, I think is really an exciting place to be.
Thank you, Kate.
For me, what gives me hope is almost close to what Kate said. The support that you give to MCC gives me hope every day, because I know that we are not alone here in Africa. There are people who care. So thank you for the support. Thank you for those warm hugs of love through prayer, through giving, through thinking about us, and also through engaging in these conversations. That means a lot for us. Sometimes when you are supporting an organization from North America that works in Africa, it looks like there's a long distance and you feel like you are not connected. I want to tell you that we feel the connection here in Africa. We feel you, we hear you, and we are with you, and that gives us hope. Thank you for your support.
Yeah, and similarly, I would say I'm really inspired by some of the actions and advocacy that I see people doing all over the US. There was just a wonderful event in Richmond, Virginia, about a week ago, a hymn sing and in front of the Richmond Capitol calling for actions on climate change and to address the negative impacts of pipelines. But also it was aimed at President Biden too, to encourage some significant action on climate change, and just really encouraged by all of that just passion and energy around this issue.
Thanks to each of you. On the news this morning, I heard a climate activist from Uganda speaking about I think she has spoken at the last at least one or potentially two COP meetings, and she was pretty strong in her approach, and it was very encouraging to hear young people speaking out like that. That kind of piece gives me that kind of a news piece in a glimpse, even though I wouldn't know this young woman. It's just like, yes, that is the generation that is taking this in hand and being very clear, very strong, very open, and we'll have many solutions that some of us hadn't thought about or hadn't moved ahead on. Kate, there was a specific question about, you had mentioned that some land protectors were murdered recently. Can you perhaps give just a tad more information about that, or maybe give a link to some information about that?
Yeah, of course. I'll drop an article in the chat. So there's a human rights report every week that tracks the number of environmental defenders who were killed. Last year it was 227, which I think really illustrates the way that climate change is a root cause of so many of these other issues that we care about and that we work on. The connection between rights and climate and peace and all of these other important issues. So I'll drop that in the chat, and if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out.
Well, I think we'll bring this to a close. We really appreciate you taking some time this afternoon or this morning, whenever this is for you, to be with us for this webinar. Pugeni, I would ask that you would take our messages from, most of us are in North America, Mexico, perhaps not Mexico, but US and Canada. Please take our messages of care and presence in spirit and prayer to your staff and also to partners there. Looking at what's next, next month, our webinar series will share an update about MCC's response to the August 14th earthquake in Haiti. So we'd invite you to join us for some stories about the creative approaches to bring relief to the most vulnerable in those situations. We're planning for some more stories of hope and resilience and faith from those local communities. I would also invite you to check out our new podcast. It's the Relief Development and Podcast series, and you can find that wherever you normally listen to podcasts. Last month's episode, we looked at MCC's response to also looked at that response to the earthquake in Haiti. And in that, we spoke to the health coordinator, our global health coordinator, Global Shetler Fast, about the distribution of relief supplies to the affected communities there. Also, Muriel Chaperon, who is the program person there, talked with her about the importance of getting relief to women and responding to trauma. So please join us for those, or go and take a look or take a listen to the podcast. The recording of this webinar will be available online soon, and it will be sent to you. So please feel free to share that with others that might be interested. We're not able to participate in that as well today. Again, really appreciate your time with us, and hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you.